We're starting our fourth unit, Transcendentalism, and for this unit we are going to be studying the novel The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So the topic for today is Chapter 1, The Prison Door. The essential questions are: what do you learn about Transcendentalist ideas? In what ways does Transcendentalism differ from Puritanism? And how do you see Transcendentalist ideas in Chapter 1? The learning targets are to determine the meaning of words and depict them in relation to how both Puritans and Transcendentalists viewed them. So what I'd like you to do is open up today's PDF, and I'm going to have you start with a free write. And so for this free write, I'm going to have you look at an image, and I'm going to have you write whatever comes to mind. I'm also going to pair the image with a quote by a man named Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he is the founder of the Transcendentalist movement. So, here's the image, and the quote is, "Our religion we have not chosen, but society has chosen for us." So pause this video now, write for 2 minutes, whatever comes to your mind, and then start the video back up. So we're gonna be focusing on the Puritans because the book is about the Puritans, and so I want you to have just a little bit of background on them. You might already know some, be familiar with them, but they were a branch of the Protestant Church, and their movement began in the 15 and 1600s. They were given the name Puritans because they wanted to purify the Church of England, who they believed was not acting and believing as they should. For example, they didn't think the church should have rituals, cushioned pews, images, or stained glass windows. So they were very simple. And there's a picture there. You can see the men on one side, the women on the other, and just the sort of clothes they wore. So the Puritans believed in the original sin. So they believed in Adam and Eve offering up the fruit to Adam, and being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, kicked out of paradise because of that sin, because God told them not to eat it, and they did. So they also believe that man is inherently sinful, that we are going to do wrong, that it is impossible for us to be perfect. They believed in literal interpretations of the Bible, and they lived very strict lives. So no dancing, no gambling, no drama like no plays, and no flavorful food. So they believed that if it tasted good, it was probably a sin to eat it. They also practiced public shaming, so they would put people like in the town center, and they would hurl insults at them, throw things at them, to punish them for something that they'd done wrong. The punishments also could include whipping, and they even executed people. The Puritans are infamous for the Salem witch trials, where there were women who were accused of being witches, and when they were accused, they could either confess and repent, or if they said that they weren't a witch, then they would be executed and they would hang them. And so if you were accused, which was often the case, and you were actually not a witch, you either had to lie and say you were, or you would die. And so if you're familiar with that, you know that a lot of women were killed. So just like we did for Enlightenment and Romanticism, we're going to contrast Puritanism with Transcendentalism, because they're kind of they are definitely on other ends of the spectrum. So Puritans believe that people are inherently sinful, they're like going to do wrong, whereas Transcendentalists believe that people are inherently good at heart. Puritans believe that dogma should lead you, so like religious doctrine, religious principles, but this dogma directly comes from the community leaders. So they kind of tell you how you should behave, what you should do, and this is what should lead your life. Whereas Transcendentalists, they were definitely against that, and they believed like your own intuition should lead you. You shouldn't need a doctrine or principles or community leaders to tell you what to do. You should just be able to sense what to do. And they believe that you should follow your heart, a lot like the Romantics. Puritans believed that you should conform to community and religious expectations, whereas Transcendentalists were like, don't conform. You are an individual, be yourself, um, sort of attitude. The Puritans believed that the wilderness is the devil's land, whereas Transcendentalists, like Romantics, valued nature and our relationship with it. Although I would argue that Transcendentalists valued it more than Romantics did because they, like you'll see in a video coming up, there was a much more of a connection with nature because unlike Romantics, Transcendentalists did believe in God, but they believed that God was in everything, and so like going out into nature, you could connect with God. So the only real similarity between the two is that they both valued self-reliance. They both thought that you should rely on yourself. You should work, you should take care of yourself, you should not depend on anybody else to do anything for you. And so very hardworking people. So I'm going to have you watch this video. It's a little clip I pulled about transcendentalism. It does start off talking about Ralph Waldo Emerson. It does reference some of his quotes because he is the founder of this movement.
Here was America. This was an extension of Emerson's ideas about the significance of the individual that came under the heading of what he called self-reliance. Everywhere Emerson looked, he saw people leading lives that were based on tradition, that were limited by religious forms and social habits. No one could be themselves, Emerson thought, because they were all too busy being what they were supposed to be. Emerson wanted to get rid of each of these burdens, the past, religion, and social forms, so that each person could find out who they truly were. As he put it, history is an impertinence and an injury. Our religion we have not chosen, but society has chosen for us, and society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. We must, he argued, live from within, trusting nothing but our own intuitions. For, as he concluded, nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. This leaves open a vital question. What is your nature once you have rid yourself of history, tradition, and religion? What can be said is that it isn't necessarily self-indulgence, hedonism, or narcissism. Rather, it's the surrender to that force which Emerson recognized back in the Jardin des Plantes, an obedience to nature itself. By nature, Emerson seemed to mean the natural world, plants, animals, rocks, and sky, but what he really meant was God. Emerson was a pantheist, that is, someone who believed that God exists in every part of creation, from the smallest grain of sand to the stars, but also, crucially, that the divine spark is in each of us. In following ourselves, we are therefore not merely being fickle or selfish, we are rather releasing a divine will that history, society, and organized religion normally hide from us.
Okay, so from that video, I want you to know that Ralph Waldo Emerson founded this idea of transcendentalism, which is the next unit that we're moving on to. And Emerson believed that at the time, people were leading lives based on tradition, that their lives were limited by religious expectations, by society's expectations of who they should be and how they should act and what they should do. And he felt like no one could actually be themselves because of these restrictions. And he wanted people to be able to find out who they really are and to just be able to be themselves and to be free to do that. One of the main differences between Romanticism and Transcendentalism is that Transcendentalists, on the whole, did believe in God, unlike Romantics, but they believed that God was in everything, okay? So God was in nature and you could connect to God with being out in nature, but God was also inside of you. And so by following your own heart, you were doing what God wanted you to do, right? And you didn't need to necessarily listen to religious leaders and people in society to tell you how to behave because knowing what to do should be innate inside of you. Okay, so Nathaniel Hawthorne is the writer whose novel we're going to read for about the next month. It's called The Scarlet Letter. And so I'd like you to know a little bit about him before we begin. So he was born in Salem, Massachusetts in 1804, and Salem probably sounds familiar to you if you've heard of the Salem witch trials. Nathaniel Hawthorne does come from a Puritan background. In fact, one of his grandfathers was John Hawthorne. So Nathaniel Hawthorne is a descendant of John Hawthorne, and John Hawthorne was one of the 3 judges in the Salem witch trials. Now, Hawthorne was really ashamed of his Puritan ancestors and what they did. And so you can see that he actually has changed the spelling of his last name to try to distance himself from them. So as far as transcendentalism goes, Hawthorne embraced some transcendentalist ideas, but not all. So he does think that nature is important. And in the Scarlet Letter, there's a great scene out in nature that helps you to see how his ideas coincide with transcendentalism. He also valued being true to yourself, and you'll see those ideas in Scarlet Letter as well. But he's not as optimistic as transcendentalists were. Hawthorne viewed humans as essentially good, but weak at times. So he's much more in the middle in this regards of transcendentalism and Puritanism, because he doesn't think people are inherently sinful and bad like Puritans, but he doesn't necessarily think that they're purely good either. Like transcendentalists are much more optimistic in this belief. He's and you'll see this in the characters of Scarlet Letter, they have good in them, but they make mistakes too. So let's talk about the Scarlet Letter. The setting. So the novel begins in June 1642 and continues over several years. Even though Hawthorne was writing this piece in the mid-1800s, so he sets it a couple hundred years before then, and it's set in a Puritan community. So this is actually taking place before the Salem witch trials happened. And his main characters are Hester Prynne, Arthur Dimmesdale, and Roger Chillingworth. So Hester Prynne, she is the woman who commits adultery, and the town knows that she committed adultery because she's pregnant, and her husband, Roger Chillingworth, she hasn't seen in years, okay? So Hester Prynne has come over to the colonies, and Roger Chillingworth is still over in England or in Europe. We're not really sure where he is, but we know he's not there. So as a form of punishment, she's forced to wear an A on her chest that tells everybody in the town that she is an adulteress. However, we know, the reader, but the town doesn't know who the father of the baby is, and his name is Arthur Dimmesdale. And Arthur Dimmesdale, feels really, really guilty about the adultery he's committed, and also about the fact that he hasn't publicly confessed, that he is, that nobody knows that he's the father, and that actually makes him feel guilty as well, that Hester Prynne is, suffering the punishment, and that he doesn't have the courage to say, I did it. And then the baby that Hester Prynne and Arthur Dimmesdale have is a little girl, and Hester names her Pearl. And so Pearl is the human embodiment of the Scarlet Letter and her parents' sin. She's the evidence, right, of the adultery that was committed between Hester and Arthur Dimmesdale. So, Roger Chillingworth, when he finds out about this, he is going to want to seek revenge, and he becomes a secret tormentor of Arthur Dimmesdale. We're going to start reading chapter 1, and we're going to do a close reading of it. And so what that is a thoughtful, critical analysis of a text that focuses on significant details or patterns in order to develop a deep and precise understanding of the text. So what I'd like you to do is, as you're reading on your PDF, I want you to highlight words and phrases that describe the building, and I want you to highlight those in brown, or another color if you don't have brown. And then highlight words, phrases that describe the vegetation, the plants, in green. And so I'm going to come out of this really quick so I can hit play um, and give you a chance to open up that file.
Chapter 1. The Prison Door. A throng of bearded men in sad-colored garments and gray steeple-crowned hats, intermixed with women, some wearing hoods and others bareheaded, was assembled in front of a wooden edifice, the door of which was heavily timbered with oak and studded with iron spikes. The founders of a new colony, whatever utopia of human virtue and happiness they might originally project, have invariably recognized it among their earliest practical necessities to allot a portion of the virgin soil as a cemetery, and another portion as the site of a prison. In accordance with this rule, it may safely be assumed that the forefathers of Boston had built the first prison house somewhere in the vicinity of Cornhill, almost as seasonably as they marked out the first burial ground on Isaac Johnson's lot, and round about his grave, which subsequently became the nucleus of all the congregated sepulchres in the old churchyard of King's Chapel. Certain it is that some 15 or 20 years after the settlement of the town, the wooden jail was already marked with weather stains and other indications of age, which gave a yet darker aspect to its beetle-browed and gloomy front. The rust on the ponderous ironwork of its oaken door looked more antique than anything else in the New World. Like all that pertains to crime, it seemed never to have known a youthful era. Before this ugly edifice, and between it and the wheel track of the street, was a grass plot, much overgrown with burdock, pigweed, apple peru, and such unsightly vegetation, which evidently found something congenial in the soil that had so early borne the black flower of civilized society, a prison. But on one side of the portal, and rooted almost at the threshold, was a wild rose bush, covered in this month of June with its delicate gems, which might be imagined to offer their fragrance and fragile beauty to a prisoner as he went in, and to the condemned criminal as he came forth to his doom, in token that the deep heart of nature could pity and be kind to him. This rose bush, by a strange chance, has been kept alive in history, but whether it had merely survived out of the stern old wilderness so long after the fall of the gigantic pines and oaks that originally overshadowed it, or whether, as there is fair authority for believing, it had sprung up under the footsteps of the sainted Anne Hutchinson as she entered the prison door, we shall not take upon us to determine. Finding it so directly on the threshold of our narrative, which is now about to issue from that inauspicious portal, we could hardly do otherwise than pluck one of its flowers and present it to the reader. It may serve, let us hope, to symbolize some sweet moral blossom that may be found along the track, or relieve the darkening close of a tale of human frailty and sorrow. Chapter 1.
All right, so hopefully when you were highlighting words to describe the building, the prison, you would have found things like heavily timbered with oak. There's the iron spikes, rust, weather stains. It's described as being gloomy and ugly. So what I want you to do in the right-hand column is so if the prison is described that way, what might Hawthorne be trying to say about Puritan society? So on a side note, right? So Puritans believed that people are inherently sinful, and so they build a town, and the first things that they put in are a cemetery because they know people are going to die, and a prison because they know people are going to sin, right? In England, the first things they put in a town are a pub and a church because that's how England goes. But thinking about how that prison is described, what might Hawthorne be trying to say about Puritan society? It definitely sounds, it does not sound pleasant, right? It's a dark place, it's beaten up, it's uninviting, iron spikes, right? It's a sad place to be. It's almost like the people in it are trapped, right? So in contrast to that, but there's beauty surrounding it. So in contrast to that, the plants, they're not described like as beautiful initially, right? Because we've got they're overgrown, right? So it doesn't sound nice, and it's unsightly vegetation. They're not pretty plants, right? But there's this idea that it's okay, right? Like nature can just be itself. It's wild. It's free, and it's okay that it's not perfect, right? Unlike the Puritans, who you had to be perfect. So there's this rose bush that's outside of the prison, and it sounds like Thanatopsis here because it says it might be imagined to offer their fragrance and fragile beauty to the prisoner as he went in, and to the condemned criminal as he came forth to his doom, in token that the deep heart of nature could pity and be kind to him. I mean, it sounds exactly like Thanatopsis in the fact that, like, nature is there for you, it comforts you. It's even capitalized, you know? Which, I mean, when you capitalize God, it's like respect and importance, and it could be seen like that. This rose bush, there's a lot of symbolism to it that we'll touch on later, but it's like even in the darkest place, like this prison, right, or even in the darkest like person, right, like who's done horrible things like commit adultery, right, or seek revenge, that there's some good in them, right? That there's some beauty in them, and no one's 100%, bad, right? There's still goodness in them, which is this transcendentalist idea, and it's Hawthorne's take on it, right? That we're not entirely good, that we're weak at times, we make mistakes, but on the whole, there's good in us. And you will see that in all of the characters in the novel. So this isn't totally relevant, but I just want to show you this really quick. So it says at the end of the paragraph, which you might have caught, that it's like, let's pluck one of its flowers and present it to the reader. So to present it to you, it may serve, let us hope, to symbolize some sweet moral blossom that may be found along the track. So Hawthorne's saying, as you read this, I hope that you find some moral blossom, some like truth, right? Like something you can learn to be better. And if that's not the case, then hopefully it will relieve the darkening close of a tale of human frailty and sorrow. In other words, this is not going to end well. This book is not going to end well. Here is a flower to make you feel better. Yeah? Gotta love Hawthorne. I love Hawthorne. This is a beautiful book. So what I'm going to have you guys do is on your final page of that attached PDF, we really want to get down to some key vocabulary and how those ideas are seen in both the Puritans and the Transcendentalists perspective. So you'll define the words, so inherent, dogma, intuition, conform, nature, and self-reliance. And then what you'll do is you'll find pictures or a series of pictures. You can even draw on them and edit them if you want, but to show what Puritans believed versus what Transcendentalists believed. So here, Puritans believed people were inherently sinful, so find something that shows that, versus Transcendentalists believe people are inherently good. Dogma, Puritans believed dogma should lead you, whereas Transcendentalists believed your own intuition should lead you. Puritans believed you should conform to community and religious expectations, whereas Transcendentalists believe you should not conform, you should be yourself. Puritans believed the wilderness is the devil's land, whereas Transcendentalists believed our relationship with nature is important. However, both Puritans and Transcendentalists believed that you should be self-reliant. When you are finished, reflect on the essential questions. Make sure that you can answer. What do you learn about Transcendentalist ideas? In what ways does Transcendentalism differ from Puritanism? And how do you see Transcendentalist ideas in Chapter 1? Also, please fill out the self-assessment on how well you feel like you can answer these essential questions, and how confident you are in the meaning of the words on the previous slide, and how you understand them in regards to both the Puritans and the Transcendentalists. Please get in touch if you need any help or you have any questions.